Why do we obey those who say the least? Think of the man who enters a room, speaks sparingly, and yet his presence dominates. His silence is not emptiness, it is a weapon. In a world that drowns us in noise, the one who withholds words gains control. And paradoxically, we listen more to what is not said than what is screamed. The modern world worships noise, from the endless chatter of social media, to politicians who flood us with empty promises, to influencers who mistake volume for authority. Everyone is talking, everyone is broadcasting. But if you pay attention, the most powerful men are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who know when to withhold, when to leave a sentence unfinished, when to let the silence linger long enough that you feel compelled to fill it. And in that moment, they control you, not with words, but with absence. Machiavelli understood this long before the modern age. His insight was simple but devastating. Power does not come from truth, it comes from perception. It does not matter what is real, only what is believed. The prince who understands this holds the mind of the people in his hands, and silence is one of the most effective tools for shaping perception. Because silence is never neutral, it forces the other to interpret, and in that interpretation, they reveal their own weakness. Contrast this with noisy authority. Today's leaders often mistake constant visibility for strength. They speak endlessly, explaining themselves, justifying themselves, promising more than they can deliver. But the more they talk, the more we see through them. Their transparency reveals their desperation. The man who explains too much admits he is not in control. He is begging to be believed, and people can smell that weakness. Now think of the opposite, the stoic ruler. The father who does not raise his voice but whose silence cuts deeper than any shout. The general who says little before battle, but whose mere presence steels his men. The respected elder who does not need to speak often, because when he finally does, everyone listens. Silence here is not emptiness, it is density. It carries weight. Carl Jung once wrote of the shadow, the unseen part of ourselves that we fear and repress. Silence works in the same way. What we do not see, we project upon, and what we project often terrifies us more than the truth itself. A man who says nothing forces you to fill in the gaps. You imagine his judgment, you imagine his disapproval, you imagine his authority. The silence becomes louder than words. Take Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. His reign was marked not by fiery speeches but by restraint. His meditations were private writings, not public declarations. Yet his presence commanded loyalty and respect. He was not feared because he threatened, but because his discipline made him untouchable. His silence was a shield against the chaos of the Roman world, a reminder that true power is not in noise but in control. Psychologically, silence functions as a mirror. When someone refuses to fill the space, you are left with your own thoughts, your own insecurities, your own desires. This is why interrogators will often remain silent after a suspect speaks. The silence is unbearable. So the suspect speaks, again revealing more than he intended. The same dynamic unfolds in everyday life. The boss who waits after asking a question compels you to keep talking, often to your own disadvantage. The man who doesn't respond to provocation makes the aggressor unravel. But here lies the paradox. We obey the silent man not because of what he commands, but because of what we imagine. We project strength onto him. We project wisdom, danger, or superiority. And in that projection, we surrender. Silence, then, is not the absence of power. It is the purest expression of it. It is the refusal to give yourself away. It is the discipline to let others reveal themselves first. And it is the knowledge that in a world addicted to noise, the one who resists the urge to speak owns the room. The man who learns this does not need to explain himself. He does not need to justify himself. His silence is already more persuasive than any argument. And this is the paradox Machiavelli would whisper to us today. The ruler who speaks least is the one most obeyed. Because silence creates fear, and fear creates obedience. But beyond fear, silence creates something deeper. It creates mystery. And in mystery, men find the authority they crave, an authority they will obey without question. Silence commands because it makes the world bend inward. And in that bending, a man either discovers his own weakness or confronts his potential for strength. Obedience does not come from strength, it comes from fear. And the deepest fear is not of punishment, but of uncertainty. What is he thinking? What does he know that I don't? That is the silent Machiavellian trick. He doesn't control you with chains. He controls you with ambiguity. He doesn't show his hand, and in not showing it, he forces you to reveal yours. The human mind is built to resist chaos. We crave order, predictability, a sense of knowing where the next step will fall. When that certainty is removed, we freeze, we hesitate, and in our hesitation, we submit. This is why silence, especially in positions of authority, carries such crushing weight. Because it leaves you stranded in the unknown, and men will cling to anything that promises them stability, even if it costs them their freedom. The psychologist Stanley Milgram proved this with chilling clarity in the 1960s. His obedience experiment revealed that ordinary people, men and women with no history of violence, would administer what they believed to be lethal shocks to a stranger, simply because a man in a white lab coat told them to. There were no chains, no threats, only the presence of authority and the uncertainty of defying it. When participants questioned themselves, silence or a short phrase from the experimenter, "The experiment must continue," was enough to push them further. It wasn't violence that made them obey. It was the ambiguity of what would happen if they refused. Machiavelli understood this centuries earlier. He wrote in The Prince that it is safer to be feared than loved, but he never meant fear as mere brutality. He meant fear as uncertainty, as unpredictability. A ruler who is silent about his intentions keeps his subjects in a state of suspended obedience. They fear not what he will do, but what he might do. The silence is more terrifying than any declaration of force. Nietzsche, too, exposed this weakness in man. He saw that people would rather live under the tyranny of rules than endure the chaos of freedom. In Beyond Good and Evil, he warns that men are more afraid of the chaotic than of any tyrant. Freedom demands responsibility, the courage to face the unknown without guarantees. Most men, lacking that courage, seek masters. They bow not to strength, but to certainty, however false. And when a master withholds certainty, when he cloaks himself in silence, he becomes irresistible. His authority is inflated by the emptiness of what is not said. This is why silence is not passive, it is active dominance. A man who holds back words forces you into submission, because you must supply the meaning yourself. Ambiguity is a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. You rush to fill it with your own fear, your own projections, your own desperate need for clarity. And in that moment, you obey. Think of the CEO who sits in a meeting and says little. The room bends around him. Subordinates scramble to interpret his silence, to guess at his approval or disapproval. They obey not because he issued commands, but because his silence makes them police themselves. Or the military commander who waits before giving orders. His soldiers, tense with uncertainty, grow hyper-focused, ready to leap at the smallest sign. Or the teacher who does not immediately correct a student's mistake. The silence hangs heavy, forcing the student to question himself, to dig deeper, to discipline his own thoughts. Each of these figures uses silence not as absence but as a mirror. The authority figure remains still, and in that stillness others reveal themselves. They confess their insecurity, their eagerness, their obedience, and once revealed, they can be controlled. This is why Machiavelli's strategy is so devastating. He knew that people fear what they cannot predict. A ruler who shouts and commands reveals his cards, but a ruler who withholds, who leaves you uncertain, who lets you stew in silence, that ruler becomes untouchable. You cannot fight what you cannot define. You cannot resist what you cannot predict, so you surrender. And yet, beneath this obedience lies a tragedy. Because when men obey out of fear of the unknown, they are not bowing to strength. They are bowing to their own weakness. They are revealing their inability to stand firm in the face of uncertainty. They are choosing chains over chaos. This is the heart of the Machiavellian silence. It does not demand your obedience directly. It makes you give it away willingly, because the unknown is too heavy to bear. The turning point is this. Every time you obey the silent authority, you are confronted with a choice. Do you submit to the ambiguity, or do you stand in it? Do you let fear dictate your action, or do you learn to endure the silence without surrendering? Because in the end, obedience to silence is not about the ruler at all. It is about you. Your fear, your projection, your hunger for certainty. The man who commands you with silence is simply holding up a mirror to the part of yourself you have not yet mastered. The unknown will always be there. The silence will always weigh upon you. The question is whether it makes you a slave or whether it forces you to become stronger than the fear itself. We reveal ourselves when we speak, but we protect ourselves when we remain silent. Every word is a risk, every explanation a surrender. The man who speaks less cannot be easily attacked, labeled, or understood. He becomes untouchable. In a world addicted to noise, silence is rebellion. Modern life trains you to announce yourself constantly. Post your thoughts, broadcast your meals, share your private life as if exposure were proof of existence. But with every disclosure, you hand over a piece of your identity. You give the world material to dissect, criticize, and categorize. The loudest men are often the most fragile, because in their hunger to be seen, they have left nothing of themselves. Unguarded, but silence, true disciplined silence, builds an armor around the self. It is not emptiness but control. Every word you do not say becomes a fortress. Every thought you withhold remains a weapon only you can wield. The man who chooses silence is not a man without words, but a man who refuses to squander them. Machiavelli knew this. In The Prince, he warns rulers to conceal their true intentions. Appear simple, appear ordinary, but inside remain complex, layered, unreadable. If others cannot predict you, they cannot control you. To reveal too much is to give your enemy a map of your weaknesses. To remain silent is to remain unfathomable. Silence is not withdrawal, it is strategy. Carl Jung offers another perspective. He called the process of becoming whole individuation, the confrontation with one's true self, stripped of masks and social performance. Silence forces that confrontation. When you stop seeking validation through speech, when you stop tailoring your words to what others want to hear, you are left alone with your inner voice. And that silence can be terrifying, because it is there, in the absence of applause or approval, that you face the raw truth of who you are. Most men flee from this. They bury themselves in chatter, in explanation, in noise. The few who embrace silence begin to carve out an identity that is unshakable because it is no longer built on the shifting sand of external validation. Look at modern society. Oversharing has become a kind of self-sabotage. Politicians ruin themselves with one careless phrase. Influencers rise and fall on the weight of their constant exposure. In the rush to speak, to explain, to clarify, they drain themselves of mystery. And once the mystery is gone, respect follows. Because what can be fully understood can be fully dismissed. Contrast this with men like Warren Buffett, a man whose public statements are famously vague, even banal. He reveals just enough to maintain trust, but never enough to expose his true strategy. His silence is deliberate, protecting the moves he makes in private. The world watches him, speculates about him, reveres him, but he remains untouchable because he has mastered the art of withholding. His silence makes him stronger than any boast could. This is the masculine principle of restraint. To remain unshaken in the face of demands for clarity, to resist the pressure to explain yourself, to justify yourself, to expose your inner workings to a world that only seeks to use them against you. The modern man has been trained to believe that transparency is virtue, that every thought must be shared, every intention announced. But transparency is vulnerability. And in a hostile world, vulnerability is rarely rewarded. Silence then becomes more than a habit. It becomes an identity. A man who controls his words controls his image. A man who refuses to reveal himself cannot be easily categorized. He becomes, in a sense, mythic. Jung would say he embodies the archetype of the wise old man, the figure, who speaks rarely but with weight, whose silence itself carries more truth than the noise of others. But the deeper truth is this: silence is power because it reveals discipline. It shows that you are not enslaved by the compulsion to be heard, to be validated, to be approved of. It shows that you have faced the terror of your own inner voice and survived. The man who speaks less does not vanish from the world. He becomes the center of it. Because in a world addicted to noise, the rare figure who withholds becomes magnetic. His silence is not emptiness but gravity. It pulls others toward him. It makes them obey, not out of command, but out of curiosity, out of respect, out of fear. The turning point comes when you realize that silence is not weakness, not passivity, not retreat. It is identity forged into a weapon. It is the refusal to let others define you, the courage to remain unreadable, and the discipline to reveal only what serves your power. And in a culture that demands constant exposure, the man who remains silent does not disappear. He becomes untouchable. But silence cuts both ways. It can liberate a man or enslave him. For silence, when weaponized, can crush identity. To obey without question is to abandon your will. And here lies the darker side of Machiavelli's strategy. The quiet master breeds quiet slaves. When silence is used as self-discipline, it strengthens identity. But when silence is imposed from above, it erases it. Blind obedience is not strength. It is surrender, and history has shown us the terrible cost of submission. Carl Jung warned that what we repress does not disappear. It festers in the shadow. And when men obey authority without question, they are often avoiding their own inner conflict. They silence themselves before they even speak, terrified of confronting their own truth. It is easier to conform, to obey, to dissolve into the mass than to wrestle with the voice inside. This is why tyrants thrive. They exploit not just fear, but avoidance. Their silence does not merely command, it suffocates. Consider the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Leaders like Stalin and Mao rarely needed to shout. Their silence, their mystery, their calculated absence created a fog of fear. No one knew what they truly intended, and in that uncertainty, people bent themselves into obedience. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Friends betrayed friends. The silence of the leader spread like a virus, teaching everyone to muzzle themselves. The result was not order, but quiet slavery. Millions living under the crushing weight of unspoken terror. Silence here is not freedom, it is domination. It manipulates the mind, making rebellion feel dangerous not because of direct punishment, but because of self-doubt. What if I'm wrong? What if he knows something I don't? What if speaking costs me everything? And so the man who might resist instead becomes his own jailer. The tyrant no longer needs to silence him. He silences himself. This is the difference between healthy silence and destructive silence. Healthy silence is chosen. It is a man's decision to restrain himself, to preserve his power, to confront his own shadow without broadcasting it to the world. It is active, conscious, rooted in strength. Destructive silence, on the other hand, is imposed. It is enforced ambiguity, designed to keep others paralyzed. It strips a man of his inner voice, turning him into an obedient shadow of himself. Nietzsche saw this danger with terrifying clarity. He believed that the herd instinct, the drive to obey, to conform, to follow, was the greatest enemy of human greatness. The herd cannot tolerate the silence of the rebel, so it demands his submission. The tyrant, in turn, uses silence to deepen that submission, to create a void so vast that the herd fills it with obedience. In such a system, Individuality is not only suppressed, it is annihilated. And yet the tragedy is that most men accept this willingly. They convince themselves that obedience is safety, that silence is stability. They give away their voices because they fear the cost of speaking. But in that surrender, they lose not only freedom, they lose themselves. Masculine introspection demands we ask, are you silent because you choose strength, or because you fear speaking? Do you control your silence, or does silence control you? If your silence comes from discipline, it is a fortress. But if your silence comes from fear, it is a prison. The silent tyrant thrives because men refuse to face this distinction. They allow themselves to be lulled into obedience by the comfort of ambiguity. But comfort is not freedom. Silence can be a teacher, but it can also be a tomb. The insight here is brutal but necessary. Silence, when weaponized, destroys identity. To obey without question is to erase the self, to abdicate responsibility for one's own life. Machiavelli revealed the power of silence, but Jung and Nietzsche remind us of its shadow. Silence can make you sovereign, or it can make you a slave. The turning point is awareness. When you obey silence blindly, you are already conquered. But when you recognize the difference, when you see the manipulation for what it is, you can reclaim silence as your own. Because the man who chooses silence out of strength is free. The man who accepts silence out of fear is already defeated.